They arrived just as the late afternoon light turned amber, the car rumbling over the last uneven stretch of gravel before the old wooden house emerged from the pines like some forgotten secret, its roof dark with moss and the windows dulled by years of grime. And Lily, who had been humming along to the radio to calm her nerves, fell silent as she stared at the place her friend Carla swore would be a dream getaway. No neighbors, total peace. The four of them, Lily, Carla, Carla's boyfriend Matt, and Jeremy, who was Lily's older cousin and the only one with experience in remote cabins, stepped out into the thick scent of sap and damp earth, feeling the temperature dip sharply under the canopy of trees, the forest pressing close on all sides with whispers of wind and the occasional snap of some unseen animal, and Jeremy muttered that it felt too quiet, no birdsong at all, which made Lily laugh nervously and say he was being dramatic. They unloaded bags, a cooler, and firewood, the house creaking faintly as they stepped onto the porch, and when Carla turned the old brass key the door groaned open to reveal a narrow hallway with faded wallpaper patterned in climbing ivy, the air inside cool and stale like a cellar. Matt made a joke about ghosts, but his voice seemed too loud, swallowed quickly by the stillness, and even he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone standing there, and Lily noticed scratch marks along the lower panels of the hallway walls, not quite like animal claws, but too jagged and deliberate to be ordinary damage. They tried to shake off the unease, claiming bedrooms upstairs, exploring the kitchen with its chipped enamel sink and a drawer full of mismatched utensils, and later they sat on the back porch overlooking a tangle of underbrush that led into the darker parts of the woods, drinking beer and laughing about their college days, until the sun set and the cold deepened and the lantern they hung from a nail above them flickered as though stirred by a hidden breeze. Around 9 they heard it, the crunch of footsteps far off, somewhere beyond the tree line, rhythmic and slow, then stopping abruptly, and Jeremy, squinting into the blackness, called out, "Hello," only to be answered by silence so thick it seemed to press against their eardrums. Carla shivered and said it was probably a deer, and Matt grinned like he agreed, but kept his hand on the hatchet he had used earlier for kindling, and Lily's thoughts went back to the scratches on the walls, the empty feel of the woods, the way the air smelled faintly metallic, like old blood, near the shed out back. They tried to ignore it, retreated inside, played cards in the living room beneath a stuffed deer head that seemed to watch them with glassy eyes. But just after midnight, as they prepared to turn in, a soft thump came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, as if someone had stepped out of one of the bedrooms. Jeremy shot up and grabbed a flashlight, motioning for them to stay back, but Matt followed anyway, both of them creeping up the stairs that groaned under their weight, and Lily and Carla held hands near the doorway, their breath shallow, listening as the beam of the flashlight swept across the landing and revealed nothing but closed doors and peeling paint, until they opened the door to the far right room and found it empty except for an old wardrobe and a single shoe in the corner, a small, pink sneaker, dirty and decades old. Jeremy cursed softly, eyes narrowing, and as they turned to leave, the wardrobe door creaked open by itself, revealing only darkness and the faint smell of rot, and from somewhere beyond the trees outside came the sound of those same footsteps again, this time closer, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the house as if someone, or something, was circling, waiting, listening, and as the others crowded at the window to see, the lantern light flickered out completely, plunging them into darkness, thick enough that Lily could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and terrified, and she felt then that they were not alone in this forgotten house, that something had been here long before they arrived, and was moving silently now through the woods, watching, patient, ready to reveal itself when the night was deep enough that no one could help them. ChatGPT. The next morning they woke late, stiff from a night of broken sleep, filled with faint sounds and the unsettling sensation of being watched, and when Lily stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, she saw that the dirt near the edge of the yard was disturbed. A series of prints too large to be from any of them, deep impressions of boots leading from the woods to the back of the house, and then vanishing into the thicket beyond the shed. And when she called Jeremy out, he crouched to examine them, his brow furrowing as he noted the heel drag that suggested someone had been moving slowly, deliberately, not just passing through. And that was when Matt joined them, rubbing his eyes, muttering that it had to be a hunter or someone from town. But even as he said it, his gaze drifted uneasily toward the dense pines. Carla insisted they were overreacting, yet she refused to go outside alone, and the mood at breakfast was subdued. Every sound from the forest amplified: the caw of a crow, the crack of a distant branch, the sighing wind threading through needles. By mid-morning, Jeremy suggested they take a look around the perimeter to ease their nerves, so he and Lily walked the narrow path that skirted the house, stepping over fallen logs and patches of ferns slick with dew, until they reached the old shed crouched beneath leaning trees, its door slightly ajar, though none of them had opened it the day before, and inside they found tools rusting on hooks, coils of rope, and a row of jars filled with murky liquid and unidentifiable objects that made Lily's stomach tighten. She asked what the jars were for, but Jeremy only shook his head, backing out into the sunlight, muttering that the place felt wrong, like it hadn't been truly abandoned. And when they returned to the house, they found Carla sitting on the steps, pale, holding something in her hand, a torn scrap of faded fabric she said she found snagged on the corner of the porch railing. A piece of a shirt maybe, but none of them recognized it, and Matt suggested it could have been left by previous visitors, though he offered no explanation for why it smelled faintly of smoke and iron. They decided to hike to the nearest ranger station to ask about other cabins, but after consulting the crumpled map, they realized the station was miles away through unmarked trails, and with the afternoon already waning, Jeremy voted to wait until morning, though that decision seemed to weigh heavily on him as the shadows lengthened. By evening they tried to act normal, cooking dinner on the propane stove, telling stories, laughing too loudly to cover their unease. But as night drew and the air grew unnaturally still, and when they stepped outside to bring in more firewood, Lily froze, pointing toward the tree line where a figure stood half hidden among the trunks, tall and motionless, too far to see a face, yet she could feel its gaze fixed on them, and before anyone could speak it stepped backward into shadow and was gone. Jeremy cursed and grabbed the flashlight, scanning the woods, while Matt muttered that he'd go check, but Carla grabbed his arm and shook her head, whispering that they should lock the doors and wait until daylight, and reluctantly they all retreated inside, bolting every entrance, drawing the curtains even though there was no one to see. Hours passed with the four of them huddled in the living room, listening to the crackle of the fire, until a rhythmic tapping began somewhere upstairs, soft at first, then louder, like fingers drumming on wood, and when Jeremy and Matt went to investigate they found nothing. Yet as they descended they heard the sound again, this time coming from the kitchen, and when they rushed in they saw the back door was standing wide open, though they swore it had been locked, cold night air pouring in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, and something sweeter, metallic, like rust or old blood. They slammed the door and checked the locks again, but now the mood was one of simmering panic, every creak of the old house making them jump, and around 2 in the morning Lily heard it, a faint scratching just outside her bedroom window, steady and deliberate, and when she peered through the curtain, she caught the briefest glimpse of a pale hand retreating into the dark, long fingers curling back into the night, as if beckoning her to follow. She stumbled back with a cry that brought Jeremy running, but when he looked there was nothing there, only the stillness of the woods and the dim outline of the shed, and he muttered that someone was out there playing games with them, though his eyes betrayed a fear he tried to mask. None of them slept after that, and by dawn they were all awake, hollow-eyed, drinking coffee in silence, until Matt decided enough was enough, and said he would hike to the ranger station himself if no one else would. But Jeremy argued they should stick together, that whoever was out there might be dangerous, and the argument escalated until Carla began to cry, her voice shaking as she asked why they were even there. What kind of place had they come to? And none of them had an answer because none of them wanted to admit what they all felt deep down, that the house in the woods was not empty, that someone had been there before them and had never really left, and that they were being watched, tested, maybe even hunted. And as they sat there in the heavy silence, the sound of slow, measured footsteps began again from somewhere beyond the trees, circling closer, closer, until it seemed they were coming from just beyond the door. They barricaded the doors with chairs and a heavy dresser after those footsteps faded, but the sense of violation lingered in the air like smoke, every board of the old house groaning under an unseen weight, and by mid-morning the tension had reached a breaking point as Matt insisted they should leave immediately. only to be reminded by Jeremy that their car was parked in a clearing half a mile down the dirt road, and someone could be waiting along the way. And Carla sat silently at the table, turning the scrap of fabric over and over in her hands, whispering that it felt warm when she first found it, as if it hadn't been out there for long. They decided to stick together and search the property in daylight, hoping to find a sign, an explanation, something to make sense of the night. And so they ventured into the woods behind the shed, stepping through patches of moss that squelched underfoot, past birches with bark peeled away in long strips, until they found a narrow track leading deeper, a path they swore hadn't been there the day before, lined with old animal traps rusted and broken. And as they followed it, the light dimmed beneath the thick canopy until they reached a clearing where an ancient fire pit sat surrounded by stones carved with crude symbols, and Lily's breath caught as she spotted a bundle of cloth tied to one of the stones, a bundle that, when Jeremy opened it, revealed more scraps of clothing and a silver pendant engraved with initials none of them recognized. The air there felt heavier, buzzing faintly in their ears, and suddenly Carla let out a cry, pointing to the ground where shallow pits had been dug and then covered, small mounds of disturbed earth, as if something had been buried there recently. And Jeremy knelt, brushing away soil until the edge of a bone surfaced, small, animal maybe. But then another fragment emerged, unmistakably human, a finger bone, pale and worn, and the group staggered back in horror. Matt cursed and said they had to leave now, forget the car and run through the woods if they had to. But Jeremy argued that running blind through unfamiliar forest could get them killed just as fast, and as they argued, a sound rose from deeper in the trees, a low rhythmic chanting, distant but drawing nearer, words they could not understand, and Lily grabbed Carla's arm, pulling her back toward the house, heart hammering, the four of them stumbling and crashing through underbrush until they burst back into the yard, gasping, their clothes torn by brambles. They locked themselves in again, shaking, and this time Jeremy searched the upstairs rooms with a grim determination, flinging open drawers, checking behind furniture, until in the attic he found an old trunk bound with rope, which he pried open to reveal photographs, dozens of them, curled and faded, showing people standing near the very house they were in, smiling awkwardly, most of them strangers, some with faces scratched out with something sharp, and tucked among the photos was a small leather notebook filled with cramped handwriting that described visitors and tests and the wood's choosing. Entries dated sporadically across decades, the last one written only 2 months ago, ending mid-sentence. Jeremy brought it down, his hands shaking, and they pored over it in the dim light, reading about disappearances and rituals, about the caretaker who watches from the trees. And Lily felt her stomach twist as she realized the descriptions matched what they had seen and heard, the footsteps, the hand at the window, and for a long time none of them spoke. By evening they sat in a circle on the living room floor, whispering plans, some frantic, some futile, when a new sound interrupted them, a dragging noise from the porch, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden boards, slow and steady, and Matt, gripping the hatchet, crept to the door and peeked through a sliver of curtain, then stumbled back pale-faced, whispering that there was a shape out there, a tall figure crouched low, dragging a large sack that left a dark smear in its wake. They watched in frozen silence as the dragging stopped, the figure rising to its full height, head tilting unnaturally as if sniffing the air, then stepping backward into the blackness, vanishing without a sound, and Carla began to sob quietly, pressing her fists to her mouth, while Lily felt a wave of nausea, the realization dawning that whatever haunted this place was not only aware of them, but playing with them, testing their fear. The night deepened, shadows thickening, and though they kept the lanterns lit, the darkness in the corner seemed to breathe, and sometime after midnight there came a scratching from beneath the floorboards, faint at first, then louder, a shuffling, as if someone were crawling through a space too small for them, and Jeremy shouted at them all to stay together as he ripped up a corner of the old rug, revealing a hatch leading down into a crawl space, the padlock on it broken recently. They stared at it, at the darkness yawning beneath, hearing a soft rustling from below, and no one wanted to move, until a voice drifted up, hoarse and low, whispering words none of them could make out, but somehow understood as an invitation, and in that moment the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging them into utter black as footsteps began again outside, circling, faster now, impatient, as though whatever had been waiting was ready to come in. Dawn bled gray through the cracked curtains, and none of them had slept. Their bodies slumped in tense positions on the living room floor, ears tuned to every creak of the house, every faint sound from the woods, and when the weak light revealed the hatch again, Jeremy declared they needed to see what was below, that they couldn't stay ignorant any longer, though Lily begged him to wait, her voice raw from a night of whispering prayers, and Carla clung to Matt's arm, eyes swollen from crying, whispering that if they opened that hatch something would come through. But Jeremy was already pulling the rug aside and shining a flashlight into the crawlspace, revealing a narrow dirt tunnel sloping deeper into shadow, the air drifting up cold and smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic that made their throats tighten. They tied a rope around Jeremy's waist, and Matt held the other end, their faces pale in the morning light, and Jeremy lowered himself in, boots scraping against the packed earth, his flashlight beam wobbling over rough-hewn walls etched with more of those crude symbols they'd seen near the stone circle, and his voice drifted up as he described a tunnel leading farther than he expected, branching off into chambers littered with bones and scraps of fabric, a pair of rusted lanterns still hanging from hooks, and then his voice caught as the light hit something else, a stack of old license plates, some bent and caked with dirt, each bearing dates from different decades, some from distant states, and beyond that a mound of objects wrapped in rotting cloth, shapes that could have been tools or could have been something far worse. Suddenly the rope twitched in Matt's hands and Jeremy's voice sharpened, whispering for them to pull him up. "Now hurry." And they strained, hauling him back through the hatch as his boots scraped the edge, and he tumbled into the room gasping, eyes wide, whispering that he heard breathing in the tunnel, deep and slow, and it wasn't his own. They slammed the hatch shut and shoved the dresser over it, but the mood had shifted, something tangible now in their minds, evidence that the house was not just a relic, but part of something larger, hidden, predatory. And as they argued about whether to run to the car or wait for help, a distant noise cut through the woods, sharp and mechanical, the roar of an engine, and they rushed to the porch just in time to see an old truck bumping along the dirt road toward them, its green paint faded, the driver a stooped figure in a wide-brimmed hat. Relief surged through them, and they waved frantically, calling out. But the truck stopped 20 yards from the house, and the engine idled, and the figure did not step out, did not speak, only raised a gloved hand and pointed toward the tree lane behind them, and when they turned they saw movement among the pines, several shapes, pale and swift, darting between trunks, too far to make out faces. Jeremy swore under his breath and shouted for them to get inside, but the truck's engine revved, and the driver shouted something unintelligible before throwing the truck into reverse and speeding back the way he came, vanishing around the bend, leaving only churned dirt and the growing sound of rustling from the woods. They fled into the house, bolting the door, hearts racing, and through a crack in the curtain Lily watched as the shapes drew closer, resolving into figures that moved with strange jerky steps, too tall, their arms hanging at odd angles, and just as they reached the edge of the yard they stopped in unison, tilting their heads as if listening to something far off, before melting back into the trees. Hours passed in that tense limbo, none of them daring to leave, until late afternoon when Jeremy insisted they make a break for the car before dark, reasoning that whoever or whatever was out there seemed to prefer night. And though fear clawed at them, they agreed, gathering their bags quickly, weapons in hand, Matt with his hatchet, Jeremy with a rusted crowbar he'd found upstairs, and they stepped into the open, scanning the woods, moving quickly down the overgrown path, toward the clearing. The air was heavy with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the distance, and every shadow felt alive. But they reached the clearing and saw the car still there, its windows fogged, and just as relief swept over them Lily froze, pointing to the driver's side door, which now hung open, and the unmistakable sight of deep scratches gouged into the paint, long ragged marks that hadn't been there before. Jeremy pushed them behind him and approached cautiously, crouching to peer inside, and found the interior empty, but for a single object placed deliberately on the dashboard, a photograph of the four of them taken the day before, laughing on the porch, but across each of their faces someone had drawn thick black slashes. Panic rose like a tide, and they spun back toward the road only to see a figure standing there, closer now, tall and still, head tilted, watching, and when Jeremy shouted at it to leave him alone, it stepped backward into the shadows and was gone, leaving only the echo of footsteps receding into the trees. They piled into the car, doors slamming, Matt turning the key with trembling hands, the engine sputtering to life, and as the tires churned gravel, they sped down the road, branches whipping against the windows, the cabin shrinking in the distance. But after a mile the road curved sharply, and they swerved to avoid a fallen tree blocking the way, screeching to a halt. And as they scrambled out to clear it, they saw that the tree hadn't fallen naturally. It had been cut, clean through, dragged into place, and on the trunk someone had carved fresh words with a knife. "You stayed too long. ChatGPT." Jeremy yanked at the branches, splinters biting into his palms as Matt hacked at the smaller limbs with the hatchet, both men working frantically while Lily and Carla kept watch, scanning the shadowed woods where sunlight barely touched the ground. And as they strained to clear the path, a sudden metallic click echoed from somewhere beyond the tree line, sharp and deliberate like the cock of a gun, freezing them all in place, hearts pounding in unison as the sound was followed by a rustling, movement and then nothing, only the hum of distant insects, and Jeremy whispered that they needed to hurry. They needed to move before whoever was out there decided to close in. At last they managed to push enough of the trunk aside for the car to squeeze through, and they dove back in, Matt slamming the door and flooring the accelerator, gravel spitting from the tires as the car lurched forward, swerving around potholes, every shadow in the rearview mirror a threat. But the narrow road seemed endless, winding deeper into unfamiliar woods instead of leading out, and Lily's breath caught as she recognized a crooked birch they had passed before, realizing with dawning horror that they were looping back somehow, trapped in a maze that should have been a simple road. Carla started to sob softly, clutching her knees, and Jeremy shouted at Matt to stop, that they were only going in circles. So Matt braked hard, the car fishtailing to a stop near another clearing where an ancient hunting blind loomed on stilts, weather-beaten and sagging, and Jeremy jumped out, dragging Matt with him, arguing in low, urgent tones about finding a vantage point to see where they were, while Lily sat frozen, scanning the woods, spotting faint movement between two pines, a quick, darting shadow that seemed to crouch and then vanish. Jeremy climbed the blind's ladder, boards creaking under his weight, and when he reached the top, he waved them up, whispering that he could see smoke in the distance, a thin gray column rising above the tree line, maybe from a chimney, maybe from a campfire. And though the thought of another human presence should have been comforting, none of them spoke as they stared at that twisting plume, wondering who or what was making it. They decided to abandon the car and go on foot, reasoning that the blocked road was a trap and the smoke might lead to safety. So they stuffed essentials into backpacks and set off, following a game trail littered with tracks they could not identify. Long, narrow prints with an odd drag mark behind them as though something heavy had been pulled along. The forest thickened, branches snagging at their clothes, and they moved in silence for what felt like hours, the smoke disappearing behind the trees only to reappear at strange angles, until at last they stumbled into a wide clearing and stopped cold. Before them stood a derelict cabin, smaller than the one they had fled, its roof partially collapsed, the door hanging from one hinge, and outside lay a rusted metal barrel still smoldering, sending up the gray smoke they had seen. Jeremy raised his crowbar and approached slowly, Matt flanking him, while Lily and Carla clung to each other. And as they neared the cabin, they saw that the barrel was full of ashes, bits of charred cloth and twisted metal, and something pale and brittle that made Jeremy curse under his breath as he realized it was bone. A sound from inside the cabin made them all flinch, a faint scraping, like something being dragged across the floor, and Jeremy motioned for them to stay back as he pushed the door wider, stepping into the gloom, where shafts of light cut through holes in the roof, illuminating piles of objects. Shoes, dozens of them, stacked in corners, some children's, some adult, all filthy and worn, and among them sat an old radio, crackling faintly though no one had touched it. He moved deeper, eyes sweeping the space, until his flashlight beam caught on something in the far corner, a stack of photographs pinned to the wall with nails, each one showing different people standing near the very same cabin, smiling in snapshots from different eras. and on the floor beneath them lay a leather satchel that, when opened, revealed bundles of ID cards, wallets, and jewelry, all tagged with scraps of paper bearing dates. Jeremy's hand shook as he sifted through them, recognizing the face of a woman on a driver's license dated 20 years ago. Then another face, a man, and another, the collection a morbid archive of those who had come before. A sudden thump behind them made him spin, crowbar raised, only to see Matt backing toward the door, eyes wide, whispering that someone was out there, moving between the trees, too many to count. They fled the cabin, scattering into the clearing, and that was when Lily tripped over something half buried in the grass, a long shallow trench covered by old boards, which broke under her weight, revealing what lay beneath. More bones, tangled together, clothing fragments, a rusted belt buckle glinting in the light. Her scream split the stillness, and Jeremy hauled her up, dragging her toward the opposite tree line as movement erupted all around them, tall figures stepping from the shadows, their faces obscured by burlap hoods, some carrying tools that caught the light like blades, others simply standing, silent and watching, and Matt shouted for them to run as he swung his hatchet wildly to keep them back. They plunged into the trees, branches tearing at their skin, the sound of pursuit close behind, footsteps heavy and unhurried as though their hunters knew the forest better than any map. And Jeremy led them down a narrow gully, leaping over roots, sliding down a bank into a dry creek bed where they crouched, gasping, hearts pounding, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then, drifting on the still air, came the faint crackle of the radio from the cabin, impossibly distant yet clear, a distorted voice repeating over and over, "You should not have come back." They crouched in that dry creek bed until their legs cramped, the forest around them eerily silent except for the thundering of their own hearts, and as the sunlight slanted lower, Jeremy whispered that they couldn't stay there, that night would fall soon, and whatever stalked them would return in force. So they moved again, following the winding bed deeper, hoping it might lead to a road or stream, the air thick with damp earth and the distant scent of smoke. And after what felt like hours they came to a place where the banks narrowed and the roots of ancient trees twisted down like skeletal hands, and there they found something half buried in the silt, a metal lockbox caked in mud, its clasp broken as if someone had tried to pry it open before, and inside lay more photographs, more scraps of paper, and a small recorder wrapped in oilcloth, still dry. Jeremy clicked it on, static filling the air. Then a voice emerged, low and shaky, a man's voice saying he'd been trapped, that the house and the woods belonged to something older than the cabins themselves, something that required offerings, something the locals had long learned not to question. And then the recording cut off, with a sharp gasp and a heavy thud that made them all shiver. They pressed on, driven by fear, until at last they heard the distant trickle of running water, and as they followed it they stumbled upon the remnants of an old fence, moss-covered posts leaning at odd angles, and beyond it a narrow trail that seemed familiar, though none of them had seen it before, a strange pull drawing them forward, until they emerged into another clearing, where the smoke they'd seen earlier rose thicker, now from a pit of glowing embers, and around it stood more of those. Hooded figures, silent, waiting. Matt froze, hatchet clenched, whispering that they had to back away. But one of the figures raised a hand and spoke, a hoarse rasp that made Lily's skin crawl, telling them they were not meant to leave, that the woods had chosen them, that the others who came before had been taken for a reason, and Jeremy shouted that they weren't staying, lifting his crowbar. But then the figure lowered its hood, and they all gasped. It was the same man who had driven the old truck earlier, his eyes glazed and hollow, his skin pale as wax, and he said again in that same broken voice that they should not have come back. Suddenly the figures advanced, slow but steady, and Matt swung his hatchet, knocking one aside, grabbing Carla's hand and pulling her toward a narrow gap in the trees, while Jeremy shoved Lily ahead of him, and they ran, branches slashing their arms, feet pounding, until they burst into another clearing and saw something that made them all stop cold. Their car, parked neatly in the center, doors closed, headlights off, as if waiting for them, and behind it the old house rose again, the same porch, the same broken windows, though they had run miles and should have been far away. Panic ripped through them as they realized the forest had folded back on itself, leading them in a circle, trapping them in the house's orbit, and Jeremy screamed in frustration, throwing the crowbar to the ground, while Carla dropped to her knees, sobbing, and Matt grabbed Lily, saying they had to try the car. Maybe it would work now. Maybe it was their only chance. They piled in again, breathless, Matt starting the engine, which roared to life instantly as though it had never sputtered before, and they sped down the road once more, the trees blurring, the shadows shifting, until they saw lanterns ahead swinging in the dusk, figures lining the path, their faces hidden, and Jeremy shouted to keep going, to break through, and Matt pressed the accelerator as the first of the hooded shapes lunged at the car, striking the windshield, smearing it with something dark. But they didn't stop. They tore through the line, hearing bodies thump against the sides, and then the trees thinned, and suddenly they were on asphalt, real asphalt, headlights illuminating a familiar green road sign pointing toward the highway. None of them spoke as they drove, not even when the lights of a small town came into view. But when they reached the first gas station, Jeremy stumbled out, shaking, telling the clerk they needed police, that there was something in those woods. But when officers arrived hours later and searched the area, they found nothing but an abandoned cabin, empty and rotting, no footprints, no figures, no sign of a pit or a trench or a hidden tunnel, as though the forest itself had swallowed every trace. Days later, safe in their own homes, they each tried to move on, yet strange things kept surfacing. Jeremy found the leather notebook from the attic on his kitchen table, though he swore he had left it behind. Carla received in the mail a photograph of herself standing on that porch, though no one had taken it. And Matt woke one night to the sound of footsteps circling his house, slow and deliberate, fading before dawn. Lily tried to convince herself it was over, that they had escaped, but sometimes in the dead of night, she would swear she heard the faint crackle of an old radio from somewhere deep in the trees beyond her window. A distorted voice whispering that same terrible phrase, soft and patient and certain. "You should not have come back.